Terraria is already a pretty fun game, but what if we remove the ability to heal normally? In turn of you only being able to heal by killing enemies, while also adding in a ton of new movement mechanics and weapons into the game, as that's exactly what the Terraria May Quake mod does. This mod changes a large chunk of Terraria to be like ULTRAKILL, like adding the ability to dash and slide, while also adding in all of the weapons and their variations, like the rocket launcher. So, I wanted to see if I could beat Terraria only using these new weapons and mechanics, which is exactly what I attempt in this video. As soon as I got into my newly created world, I immediately threw my copper sword onto a slime to get rid of it in a beneficial way, and then started messing around with the mod's mechanics, like being able to slide, dash, and ground slam, which makes mobs go flying. Once I felt like I understood it enough though, I then got to work on building my first house. But while I was getting some wood, a slime ended up spawning in, so I got my first chance to try out the revolver I spawned in with, which is also the same pistol you start out with in ULTRAKILL. After I missed a few of my shots, I finally landed a shot on the slime, which is when I learned that not only is there the combo text at the bottom left of my screen, but that killing enemies is also the only way that I can heal. This was also when I noticed that your HP starts off with a full set of hearts, but when you hover over it, it still says the max is only at 100. After I finished building the house, I went straight into a cave to the right of my base, and started looking for gold and a ruby for King Slime. Right at the start of the cave, I ended up finding 2 chests, one of which had an aglet in it, but right after this, a slime tried to attack me. So I decided that I'd use the little guy to test the alt fire on the pistol, which ended up making a charged shot that deals a ton of damage once you choose to fire it, just like the revolver in ULTRAKILL. After that, I went deeper into the cave and managed to find a huge deposit of gold, and even a life crystal beside that. But after I tried to use the life crystal, I realized that the mod doesn't allow you to upgrade your health, so I was gonna be stuck at 100 health the entire game. I kept going deeper into the cave, finding more gold and chests, until I eventually ended up falling to my death. So, after I respawned, I decided to start crafting some better gear, but that's when I realized I'm able to make a better revolver that could deal 45 damage, with it only requiring the revolver I spawned in with to craft. So, I went ahead and did just that. After this, I decided to finish out the rest of the night by doing some exploring while trying to farm Demon Eyes. But by the time it was morning, I only ended up getting 3 out of the 7 lenses that I needed for the Eye of Cthulhu. So I was gonna have to push that boss off for a little longer. In the meantime though, I went ahead and made a storage building to hold my items and crafting stations that I couldn't fit into my house, alongside the next NPC house, so that way I could get the merchant to move in. But afterwards, I went mining in the desert. My goal was to hopefully get everything needed to make a set of fossil armor. But instead of finding anything at all related to crafting that, I ended up dying to a boulder that I triggered, in hopes of it going the opposite direction. After this, it was starting to get dark outside, so I decided to wait until it was night to start farming Demon Eyes again. But since I didn't want to waste time, I went ahead and started making my elevator. Once it was finally night though, I teleported back home and started farming Demon Eyes. And luckily, this time around, I was finally able to get the 7 lenses that I needed. Not wanting to try and find my Crimson biome during the night, I went back to making my elevator until it was morning. Then I made a dash over to my evil biome, and finally made the Eye of Cthulhu spawner. But once I got back home, I realized I also had everything I needed to make the King Slime spawner. So I ran back over to the Crimson biome again to craft that as well. By the time I got done with making both of those spawners, it was still day outside. So I decided to go ahead and try to fight King Slime. I started out by trying to trap it inside of my house, like I do for every King Slime fight, which was pretty easy with the help of my dash. So it wasn't long before I eventually defeated it. Alongside its normal loot, I ended up getting the coin version of the revolver. If you don't already know, in ULTRAKILL, each weapon has alternative forms that do different things. The coin variation specifically allows you to throw up a coin, and once you shoot it, your bullet will bounce off of the coin and hit the nearest enemy for a ton of damage. And that's exactly how it works in the Terraria mod as well. Getting back to the playthrough now, since it was still daytime, I decided to kill time by working on my elevator some more. But by the time I ended up accidentally drowning and respawning, it was finally nighttime. So I went ahead and started the Eye of Cthulhu fight. I started out by trying to use the coin revolver, but after not being able to land my shots correctly, I moved over to the other revolver I had. And between its alt fire and my dashes, I was able to defeat it, which is when I got the shotgun. The very first thing I did with this was see if I could shotgun boost myself, like you can in ULTRAKILL. But all it did was take out most of my health. After that mistake, I got back to working on my elevator, and this time around, I was finally able to reach the underworld. I immediately started building a bridge across the underworld, so I could fight the Wall of Flesh. And after falling off of it and dying at the same spot twice, I managed to make the bridge about 700 blocks, which I thought would be enough for the Wall of Flesh. Keyword there being thought. Right after that, I got started on collecting some Hellstone, alongside some obsidian, and ended up using them to make a Hellstone helmet and a pair of boots. With those new gear upgrades, I felt like I was finally ready to take on the Wall of Flesh. So I made my way down to the underworld, threw my doll out, and then ended up dying after I realized that I didn't end up throwing my doll out far enough. So I made my way back down to the underworld again, and actually spawned in the Wall of Flesh successfully this time around. But by the time I got it down to about half of its health using the shotgun and revolver, I ended up reaching the end of my bridge, and ended up dying not too long after that. Right after this, I depressingly did some mining, and then used those blocks to extend my bridge out a few hundred blocks more, before eventually trying to spawn in the Wall of Flesh again. But I only realized after the doll went into the lava that my guide hasn't respawned yet. Luckily, I ended up getting another voodoo doll right after. And then, to make sure my guide would respawn even if I failed the fight again, I went back up to my base and made some more NPC houses. Once they were all made, I ended up making the molten chestplate to complete my molten armor set. And by the time I finished that, the guide finally moved into one of the newly made houses. So I went back down to the underworld to try and fight the Wall of Flesh again. This time around, the fight was going really well, with me knocking out most of its health using the shotgun. But just like last time, by the time it got around to the last chunk of its health, I found out my bridge was still too short. So I ended up dying again. After this, I once again went mining for a ton of blocks to extend my bridge. But this time, I ended up getting over 500 blocks, just to be 100% sure that my bridge would be long enough next time around. Once I had all of them placed, I spawned in the Wall of Flesh for a third time. And luckily, this time around, I finally defeated it, thanks to my bridge being long enough. Right after this, I knew I needed to go find my Hallo Biome, so that's what I started looking for. I started by going over to the right side of my world, and while I didn't end up finding the Hallo Biome, I did run into the dungeon, and thought I might as well go ahead and fight Skeletron here, so I did just that. This fight was the easiest so far, with me being able to slide under his arms and dash through the gaps between his head and arms. I mainly used the coin and normal revolver for this, as I kept missing my charged shotgun shots. But regardless of that, it wasn't long until I finally finished him off, and that's when I got the nail gun. I went back to my base after this, and just thought that it would be a good idea to make my base a Hallo Biome, in hopes I can get a unicorn mount. So I got some dirt, spent all my money on seeds from the Dryad, and started planting them around my house. Once I got done, I, of course, had to wait for it all to grow in. So, in the meantime, I went back looking for my naturally spawned Hallo Biome. Not too far after heading out to the left side of my world, I ran into my jungle and thought it was most likely a good idea to go beat Queen Bee to see what weapon I'd get from her. So I dropped down into a cave, trying to find a beehive. But that's when I realized that the water was purple here, meaning I finally found my Hallo Biome. I kept going deeper looking for the beehive, which ended up taking longer than I'd like to admit. But while I was here, I decided to try out the nail gun I got from Skeletron, and was shocked to find that it was basically an automatic weapon that had bullets which would bounce off of everything, easily making it my best weapon so far. Not too long after this, I finally got lucky enough and found a beehive. But as I started to dig into it, I lost my light source, and ended up starting the fight by mistake, right after getting into the beehive. And on top of that, I only had a little bit of land to stand on for this fight. After placing some torches, and quickly getting myself sorted, it wasn't too long before I was able to start hammering Queen Bee with bullets, as the nail gun can bounce off of everything. And once it was defeated, I was super excited to see that I finally got my hands on the rocket launcher. In ULTRAKILL, you can use the rocket launcher to shoot out a rocket, freeze it, and then hop on top of it to start flying around on that rocket for a bit. And it's arguably the fastest way to get around in that game. So I wanted to see if it was the same in Terraria. Once I got back to my base, I shot out the rocket and tried to jump on it, but nothing happened. Luckily though, it just turns out I'm pretty bad with timing things, as the next time I tried it, I got locked onto the rocket, and once I unfreezed it, I started getting zoomed around by the rocket. I messed around with that for a bit, as it was pretty fun, and thought it could be useful for the mech fights. But before I could really start planning that out, I needed to get the mech boss spawners. So, after I made a new NPC house, that's what I got started on. I first went back to the underground jungle, as that's where my underground Hallo Biome was at, and stayed there farming enemies, dying, and then coming back to farm more, until I finally got 9 Souls of Light. After this, I wanted to get the 9 Souls of Night that I needed, so I went a little further past the jungle biome to the Crimson biome. At first, it was very slow, and the herplings were able to kill me super easily because of my awful aim. But for some reason, after I made a second lair to get away from those things, eventually I started getting Souls of Night really quickly. So it wasn't too long until I finally got enough and teleported back to my base. Now that I had my souls, I had to get a hard mode anvil to be able to craft the mechanical boss spawners. Nothing really interesting out of the ordinary, progression-wise, really happened here, with me first breaking as many Crimson Altars that I could, finding and working my way through the early hard mode ores, and eventually ending it off with crafting a mithril anvil and pickaxe. At this point, the last set of items I needed to craft the mechanical boss spawners were the enemy drops, like bones. So I first went over to the dungeon. After using the railgun to clear out paths, and dying multiple times to me dashing around, I got the 30 bones that I needed. So I went over to the Crimson to get the vertebrae that I needed. Unlike the dungeon, I was having awful luck getting any vertebrae to drop. But for some reason, they finally just started dropping from almost every enemy I killed. So I was finally able to go back home and craft the mechanical boss spawners, which is exactly what I did. Since it was already night after I crafted all of them, I decided to go ahead and try to fight one of them, which ended up being the Destroyer. This fight ended up being a little tricky, since the Destroyer could wrap around me before I could slide past him. But between me constantly using the nail gun, the rail cannon, and the rocket launcher, I was eventually able to defeat it. After digging a small hole so I could get the items it dropped, I went back over to my base and made a hallowed helmet for its range damage boost. Since it was still night, but too late into the night to fight the next boss, I decided to use an extra Eye of Cthulhu spawner I had, and ended up beating it in only one shot from my rail cannon. I got a duplicate shotgun from it. So instead of just trashing it, I decided to use it to craft one of the shotgun's alternative forms, the jackhammer. After that, I waited until it was 7 PM again, and then spawned in Skeletron Prime. Almost right after the fight started though, I realized that unlike most of everything else in this mod, I can't heal myself with the railgun. So I ended up almost dying multiple times. But towards the end of the fight, everything got a lot easier, when I also realized the rocket launcher worked great on it, which is how I ended up beating it. After this, I again waited until it was the next night, and then spawned in the last mechanical boss, the twins. Just like last fight, my rail cannon couldn't heal me, so I was left to have to pull out my rocket launcher every so often to heal myself up. And also, like the last fight, I almost ended up dying a lot, but luckily, I was able to finish them off using a charged rail cannon shot. With the hallowed bars I got between all of the bosses, I was able to finish my hallowed armor set. At this point, the next thing I needed to do was go fight Plantera. But I was pretty tired of fighting bosses at this point, so instead, I decided to finally test out my jackhammer. If you don't already know, in ULTRAKILL, you can use the jackhammer to bounce off of enemies, and luckily, that's exactly how it works in Terraria, with me bouncing straight into space after using it on a unicorn. I ended up dying on the way back down, so I went to try it again on a slime, but this time, instead of just falling, I tried to spawn in a rocket so I could get to the ground safely. And to my surprise, that actually ended up working. After that though, it was time for me to start the painful hunt for a Plantera bulb. Eventually, after a while of looking, I ended up finding a bulb beside a granite cave. So, after I made a small bridge across the cave, so I'd have something to stand on for the fight, I broke the bulb and spawned in Plantera. Unlike the past two boss fights, this time around, I was able to use my nail gun to heal myself. But regardless of that, the fight was still pretty tough. And the small space I gave myself for the fight didn't make it any easier. So I got close to dying a lot. Eventually though, with me constantly dashing and shooting my nail gun, I was able to whittle it down to a point where I was able to defeat it with one shot from my rail cannon. Now that Plantera was done with, the next boss was Golem, which is what I immediately started heading to do. I already knew where the jungle temple was, so it didn't take me long to get there. And then I started exploring it, using my nail gun as both a weapon and as a light. After only dying to the lizard and traps a few times, I finally made it to the altar room. And thinking this would be an easy fight, I spawned in Golem right away. But that didn't end up being the case. The main issue I had was not being able to heal fast enough. So I thought placing some platforms to move across could help me dodge better. And while it did help out, it wasn't enough. And I kept dying each time I tried the fight. Eventually though, on my fourth try, I figured out that if I used my revolver as my main weapon, I'd be able to heal fast enough. And although it made the fight a lot longer than it had to be, I was able to eventually defeat Golem. After this, I went back to my base to place all the loot I stole from the temple, but afterwards, instead of just heading straight for the next boss like I've been doing, I decided that I should probably go ahead and upgrade my armor, so I have better odds at beating Moonlord, with Shroomite armor being what I had in mind. For this, I needed to get a ton of chlorophyte, which meant I also needed to upgrade my pickaxe. So, after I made the hallowed pickaxe axe, I went to the underground jungle and painfully spent what felt like way too long looking for over 300 blocks of chlorophyte ore. Once I had that though, then I had to get the truffle to move in, so I could buy the auto hammer. And while I was down in the mushroom biome, I also went ahead and collected the glowing mushroom items that I needed. After waiting a while for the truffle to spawn in, I bought my auto hammer, and then went back up to my base to use it to start making my shroomite armor, with the helmet being the shroomite headgear, since it gives you a boost to range damage. Now that I had better armor, I felt like I was ready to take on Moonlord. I went over to the dungeon, but before starting the fight, I made about a 400 block long bridge using dirt, so I'd have a flat area to do the fight in. But as soon as I got done with that, I went back over to the dungeon and spawned in the cultist. Like Golem, I found out that the best way for me to heal was to use my revolver, but I wasn't able to use the rail cannon as soon as it was ready to be used, as it was the only way I could one-hit the cultist's dragon. Although it was very slow, slower than Golem, since I had to time my rail cannon shots correctly, I was eventually able to get it down to under 100 health, and took out the cultist with one more rail cannon shot. Right after this, the vortex pillar spawned under me, and although I tried to start fighting it, I ended up dying to its enemies not too long after that. Once I respawned, I decided to start with the pillar directly to the right of my base, which was the solar pillar. After dying a couple of times, I very quickly found out that trying to shoot the enemies one by one wasn't effective at all. So instead, I figured out that I could shoot them with my revolver to stay healed, while I trained them around like a crawler from COD Zombies. And then, once fully charged, I'd use my rail cannon to kill as many as I could in one go. I was able to eventually get the pillar shield taken down doing that, and then I just started spamming the rail cannon on the pillar until I defeated it. Now that I had the pillar to the right of my base taken out, I wanted to do the one on the left side of my base, which was the Stardust pillar. It ended up spawning above a living tree, so the only option to get up there was to hop on one of my rockets, which, while being fun at first, quickly became annoying after having to do it each time I respawned. That being said though, I ended up dying less with this pillar, since I was able to farm health on the enemies that basically respawned. So it wasn't long before I had the shield down, and then I just spammed my rail cannon on the pillar until it was defeated. For the third pillar, I decided to take out the Nebula one, which ended up being on the far left side of my world, while also arguably being the hardest pillar in this playthrough. Unlike the last two pillars, I wasn't really able to group up the enemies, so I could take out a lot of them at once. So I instead had to mainly take out the shield by going through each enemy one by one, which normally wouldn't be that bad. But each time I died, I had to make an extremely long journey back over to this pillar, so it became annoying quickly. But once I had its shield down, I was able to damage the pillar itself a lot faster using the rail cannon after its shield. So it wasn't long before I defeated it. Now there was only one pillar left, the Vortex pillar, that I already died to once. I was expecting this pillar to be the hardest out of the four, but it actually ended up being the easiest, as the dirt bridge allowed me to quickly group up enemies that I could wipe out using the rail cannon, while also using them to heal myself with the revolver. Once I got its shield down, I had to move down to the desert under the bridge so I could actually damage the pillar. And because of that, I ended up dying a lot more than I had when I was on the bridge. But eventually, with enough rail cannon shots, I was able to defeat the final pillar. And now it was finally time for the last boss of the game, Moonlord. I decided to do the fight on the dirt bridge I made by the dungeon, as I realized it's really the only flat place I could do this fight. Once Moonlord eventually spawned in, I started off by going after its hands, mainly using my rail cannon. And then, while it was charging up, I'd switch to my revolver to keep myself healed. And surprisingly, while it wasn't dealing a ton of damage, it was doing a noticeable amount. So I knew this could work out. I was really worried about getting to its heart stage, as I didn't think I'd be able to damage it through the dirt block bridge, which also meant I wouldn't have been able to heal myself. So once I did reach that stage, I went down to the desert below to finish out the fight, thinking I'd be able to hit Moonlord's heart easier, but instead, I wasn't able to hit it at all down there, After that mistake, I went back up to the dirt bridge, and ended up figuring out that I could actually shoot through the bridge. So I just did what I did for Moonlord's first stage, where I'd mainly damage the heart by using my rail cannon, and then, while waiting for it to charge back up, I'd spam my revolver to stay healed up. After a while of doing this cycle, I got Moonlord down to roughly 3,000 health. Then it started quickly healing back up, so I shot my rail cannon. And that ended up being enough damage to finally defeat Moonlord, bringing an end to this playthrough. Like most of my playthroughs, I released the map I used in this playthrough on the Steam Workshop, but if you're on mobile, then you can get the world file from my Discord server. Thanks for sticking to the end. Be sure to like and subscribe for more Terraria videos like this in the future. And, as always, make sure to have a wonderful day.